All right, cool, sweet. Yeah. So bear with us first stream. So, just to go into just like a little bit of like the history of this, I think I've always wanted to do something for a tournament that is specifically focused on breaking down tournament strategy, breaking down some of the ways to approach legislation, looking at what like legislations I think is strong-sided and weak-sided and things like that. And a lot of this comes from the fact that a lot of debaters tend to ask, um, basically just like, oh, like, what do you think of this legislation? How would you approach this? What is your prep process? What is your research process? And I kind of just want to simplify that for everyone just so that they can see like this is how I would think through a tournament. This is how I would approach something like this. And yeah, hopefully it'll be in a very fun setting. So I also, use the chat if you have any questions. Share this link with your friends and whatnot. And of course, this will be going up on our YouTube. It will exist here. It'll live here. So even if you're not watching live right now, you can go ahead and look at that and enjoy it. So yeah. Okay. I don't want to waste any time, and I want to get right into it. So, the biggest change that Harvard has made this year, obviously happens with this kind of new rule set they're creating, or as I like to call it, sectioning protocols. So, you can look over this here, you can read it, but the long story short of it is now there is no hour cap. And now prelim chambers are going to be resectioned or mixed around, right? So when you traditionally have like, oh, you get assigned a prelim, you're with the same competitors, with the same people for all three rounds for however many pieces of legislation. Now what they're going to have you do is you are going to, one, have a set docket, which means you will debate these pieces of legislation in order. You can't change them around. You can't switch them around with each other. And because of that, every chamber or every round you will get mixed around with other people. So I could be in a room with 12 different people, and then next round I am in a room with a bunch of other different people. I guess the thought process behind this is that the tournament really wants to go for this approach of we want to see more dynamic results, more diversity of debating and diversity of like legislation being talked about. And if you've been to Ascend Academy sessions, if you've been to Sandal Academy sessions, you already know that my thoughts on this are is that this is wonderful for parliamentarians and just like yeah, it is wonderful for parliamentarians. The reason being is because as a parliamentarian, as someone who has judged like rounds, I honestly usually figure out who is in this like top six, top maybe eight or seven range. Um, the reason being is because there honestly isn't that much movement. Um, People kind of just like show themselves, and especially at tournaments as large as Harvard, there becomes like a pretty obvious, oh, these are the people who are in it, and these are the people who are, not really there. With that being said, there's usually some movement between like these like I guess bubble spots, if you want to call it, between like four, five, six, and maybe in seven. Um, but I think that this is something that makes just parlaying easier. I like the idea that you get to see new competitors, see new arguments. It honestly helps with the voting a little bit. Now, they do have in the rule set here that there's more flexibility for assigning parliamentarians. I don't really know if there's going to be like that parliamentarian role anymore. The reason why I say this is because it doesn't make sense to have someone who is supposed to watch everyone when like rounds are constantly rotating and changing. So I don't know if they're going to have like a parliamentarian in the traditional sense. But there might be a judge that is up there and maybe given a parley role, maybe they have a little bit more judging authority. I don't know. We're honestly going to have to find out when the tournament happens. But with that being said, from a judging standpoint, I think this is interesting and I think I like this. From a competitor standpoint, I would have hated this. I would have hated to go into round. I would have hated to deal with switching chambers for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's really fun to just debate against a bunch of people for like a long period of time and like form sort of like a quote unquote like a chamber rivalry or like a prelim chamber rivalry where you are going against people or like there's like a one, a two, a three, and you're really just trying to prove you're the best of the bunch. And I think it's a really good warm up to like get into that consistent flow and just like interact with people. And it's a fun way of kind of just like moving on throughout the tournament because then you'll meet people who are like, hey, like I plan on going this on this legislation, or like, hey, I plan on POing for that bill, and then oh, okay, you can talk mingle. it's a lot easier to make friends and socialize, in my opinion, because you're with people, you can bond over things that happen in round, talk outside after that, things of that nature. And on top of this, I my honest thoughts are is this would make it a lot easier for someone to just PO their way out of prelims. The reason why I say this is because if you're mixing around chambers, reasonably speaking, there's nothing stopping someone from like POing 4 times in a row. Do I think that's interesting? Do I think that's entertaining? No, I don't. I really don't see the appeal of it. But I think that kind of like, the Dodgers abusing this salary cap right now, that's the way that the rules are. And as long as that's the way that the rules are, someone can probably use that to their advantage. And I honestly wouldn't like blame them or fault them for it. So I think if you're looking for a really easy way to break out of prelims, what you can go up and do is you can train really hard on POing. You can watch the Ascend POing video, learn everything, be straight to the point. As long as you're getting the round on time or somewhat on time, even earlier, throw in a couple of jokes, no mistakes, you're good. You're going to break. I don't think that there's going to be a single problem with a PO breaking from prelims if they're just like halfway decent. Um, and I don't know. I think like this from a competitor standpoint, the other thing that I really don't like about this is the idea of set pieces of legislation. The reason why I don't like set pieces of legislation is because if you have a legislation that is particularly bad, one-sided, or whatever, you can't change that around. You're kind of stuck with that legislation. You're stuck debating it in that order, and you're kind of left to the mercy of that. Now, I am a fan of students being able to explore different topics, to be able to introduce pieces of legislation, and just be able to share their passions through writing legislation that they can debate over and excuse me, make genuine conversation and change over. However, when it comes to a system where you are locked into those pieces of legislation or a tournament that is as big as Harvard, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that someone like student submitted legislation should be the only thing that exists there. I think that yes, student legislation is fun to write, but I think that oftentimes it is not completely one-sided. It is not the most original debate. And if I go through the Harvard docket right now, I will see a lot of repeat legislation, either from the previous year or from previous tournaments. Now, again, from a prepping standpoint, from a student standpoint, this is probably amazing. You just get to pull out old prep, you get to speak off of it again, you get to do the same cross-ex, the same song and dance. From a judging perspective, this is really hard to watch, especially if you have a judge that has competed before or have a judge that has judged these topics before because it's the same stale thing over and over and over again. And in my mind, I have arguments that I'm already looking out for. I'm like, oh, I saw that argument win last time. I'm waiting for someone to either top that with a response or I already know that this is what I'm going to go for. So I think with that being said, this is the tournament, this is the rules, this is like the way that'll be. But I don't think I would want to see this at future national tournaments if I was a competitor. If I'm a judge, I don't really care too much. The other thing about the format change is I believe that we have 4 prelims now and 2 quarter rounds, if I'm being correct. Let me look at the schedule. Do they have it here? Let's see. Rules. Okay, yeah, varsity schedule, round one, round two, round three, round four, quarterfinal session one, quarterfinal session two, and then one semifinal round and one final round. So yeah, I guess the idea here is that because you are only like basically like look at this, we're only debating 2 bills per prelim session. The idea is put in an extra quarter as well. I assume they'll do the same like chamber mixing thing that they did in prelims, and then that's not going to exist in Sems, and that's not going to exist in finals. Um, Hopefully this makes debate shorter. I feel like if I was a debater, like yes, it's I guess less pieces of legislation to prep because you know what you're going to debate. But this looks like a really exhausting schedule. I don't know if I would have been able to do all this, but hopefully rounds are shorter. Um, and at the same time, there is, like they said, there's no hour cap anymore. Um, so theoretically speaking, we can have more debate. We can go on for as long as I want. I know it was an issue in previous years to have the hour cap because you would have debaters that were really good that didn't get to give a second speech because maybe the PO messed up, maybe the PO was slow, or maybe just things held up time. I remember my freshman year, there was a debater named, I believe, Luke Tyson. He had won the Harvard round robin and he was in Harvard finals and he gave it his first speech and it was amazing. Like he was dominating the round, he was killing it, like he was in flow state, but the PO at the time messed up the timing procedure and thought that someone said like 320 in terms of like, oh, the round ends at 320, but no, it was that there were only 3 hours and 20 minutes to debate. And so this really good debater didn't get a second speech, ended up still getting top six, I think. But it's like one of those moments where it's like, wow, that was like the clear dominant person in the room who didn't get to, go and give their second speech. This also happened to um, Fadil Lawal, Harvard Sems, his senior year, only got to give one speech. Love Fadil. Granted, that one speech wasn't as good as it possibly could be, but I think this is like implemented to correct some of the issues. I have mixed feelings about this because I've seen debaters not get their second speech in because of this hour cap. But in a way, I did like the hour cap rule because it felt like it kept things moving. And I'm more of a fan of debating three pieces of legislation contained to an hour rather than like two pieces of legislation and just moving and going from there. Um, Besides that, though, I don't know. Theoretically speaking, if there's no hour cap and there's no time cap, like you could give second speeches on a bill. I'm a fan of giving second speeches. I am a fan of giving as many speeches as you possibly can. Famously, Helios Lung won Harvard, I believe it was his junior year, giving three speeches in Harvard finals, instead of the traditional two that you would get out of the debaters. That being said, it is just advantageous to give as many speeches as you can. Why? You're maximizing the time that you get to show judges that you're the best. You're maximizing the time that judges see you as like the person to beat. Um, and it's more speaking time. It's more memorability. It's those things that judges are looking for. And if you had maybe a flaw in a first speech, you can plug that up with a good second speech or third speech. And I've only seen, at least this is me like watching rounds myself. I've only seen these extra speeches help debaters more than it hurts them. So to go over, I should honestly be like logging my thoughts here. So, new Harvard rules. POing is a cheat code. POing in quarters. Probably deal. Um, Good for judges in terms of praise and extending their attention span. What else? What else did I say? If the legislation isn't balanced or isn't good, this can make debate bad. Um, Hour cap elimination, meh. And then always take a chance to speak again if it presents itself. More on this. I am aware. I think with the hour cap being gone, this becomes a lot easier to like talk about slash a lot easier to understand why it's advantageous or even to justify. I know it's a really big thing in the in just debate community or just like Congress debate to like someone goes up before the round and they're like, hey, can we agree to base two speeches? That is nice. And yes, like that kind of sentiment is really good. I think everyone should be able to give, at least two speeches if everyone is given two. But I don't think that, like, if you have the chance to give a third speech, you should take it. You are in a competition. If your goal is to win, if your goal is to move on to the next round, if your goal is to get your bid, whatever your goal is, you cannot hamper yourself from achieving that goal by agreeing to base two because there is nothing in the tournament rule book that says base two, base two speeches. I don't think there's anything in the tournament rule set that says that. And let me just like look that up. Base, yeah, I don't think there's base two, um, 2 types of speeches, preferential ranking. Yeah, there's nothing in the rule set that says that you have to constrict yourself or limit yourself to two speeches. Yes, I think if someone has one speech and everyone else has two speech, like they should probably like do their best to get that other speech in. But let's say, for example, you're in Harvard quarters. There's a terribly you already like everyone already gave a speech on like the previous legislation or on the second legislation now, and it's super imbalanced. There's like I don't know, 9 affirmation speakers and then like 4 like negation speakers and things like that. Either you have affirmation people start flipping, or you as a negation speaker, maybe you gave the first negation speech, why not go up there and give more refutation now on a bunch of these affirmation speakers? Like, if there is that opportunity for you to speak again, you should take it. So, yes, I think that people should have an equal amount of like say, so to speak, in terms of if everyone should speak once on a piece of legislation, but you yourself shouldn't hamper yourself from speaking a third time. Maybe it's a second time on a piece of legislation, or maybe it's a second time on 2 pieces of legislation. Like at the end of the day, this is a competition, and that is what you should do to put your best foot forward in terms of winning, doing your best, doing better, and things like that. Now, if you are giving a third speech and that is shutting someone out of getting their second speech, okay, different story. Like you keep in mind those types of things. And also keep in mind like how exhausted the judges are or how convinced that the judges are that your side is winning or the other side is winning, right? If I am on a debate that is like particularly balanced, we're running out of time, and I already felt that my first speech was really good. It seems like the judges are like the debate is going well, and the judges are already buying my side slash like the affirmation or whatever speech I gave. Not too much of a point of giving a third speech after that because it's like, well, the point's already been made. The other side is obviously very weak, and why go from there and things like that. But that's just kind of the competitive mindset that I think you have to have in these situations. If you don't want to have that, it's fine as well. But you kind of just have to have some acceptance of the fact that like it might not work out your way. And like I said, there's also a lot of times where the debate is not very good in terms of there were a lot of recesses taken. There is a lot of what's it called? There's a lot of breaks. There's a lot of pauses. A lot of what's it called? Like, back to back speakers, like 2 apps in a row or 2 negs in a row. I think at that point that the round has gone longer than it should. Judges are tired. They don't really care to hear another thing. And then you can comfortably move on. And to the chat, are you saying it's okay to speak twice on the same piece of legislation? Absolutely. If the opportunity presents itself and you feel that you need to advance your side, advance your speech as you've done it before, speak again on that piece of legislation. Strategy wise, it should probably be on the last legislation that is being debated because if you speak twice on the first piece of legislation, aside from this kind of like sponsor final appeal rule, you might mess yourself up in terms of speech recency, and then you might get super, super pushed back in that second speech, and you might not get to speak on that legislative topic. So if you're gonna go for a second speech, probably make it on like that second piece of legislation. And seeing that it's a set docket order, I think that's the kind of thing that you have to keep in mind with prep of I have this. What is this second speech going forward that I could probably bring up and talk about? Um, and that brings me to the other thing, the final appeal. The final appeal. What can I say about this? This is pretty good. On the same side, right? Yeah, same side. Does not make that much sense. To speak on one side and speak on the other side. That might be against the rules, but I've never seen anyone do it. Let's not have it start now. But yeah, you don't speak on the same side. Um, Final appeals. So, if you don't know, this is a feature of the Harvard tournament. This is also a feature of the Martin Luther King Jr. tournament at my old high school, James Logan. This is a feature of Emory, I think. And the basic idea is that it is meant to encourage sponsorships because we all know that sponsorships don't tend to stand. So, what is available to happen is a sponsorship goes up, gives their sponsorship speech, and they are guaranteed to be the last speaker in the round. So, basically, when the round ends, either on an ask speech or on an egg speech, we'll motion to previous question. And then before we do the voting, there's the final appeal. So, the sponsor comes up and they give a speech that is a minute and 30 seconds. A minute and 30 seconds. Um, this is something that I've not seen a lot of people utilize, even though I think it is like a pretty good tool to use. And the reason being is because getting the final word in, being able to do kind of the good things about debate that we like to talk about, like doing weighing or doing refutation and kind of just getting the last say in on the legislation is super valuable and super important. Do I think that you should spam a final appeal like every single bill? No. Like if I had like to advise you on an ideal strategy to use, it would probably be sponsor the first piece of legislation. That way you can give your sponsorship speech, give the final appeal, and then on the second piece of legislation, you basically get to speak wherever you want because even though you get this second speech, it doesn't count against your recency. So you're still first in recency. It just counts you as you gave the sponsor. So you can basically speak any position that you want on the second piece of legislation. But also use it as a way to, correct your recency if it's really bad, right? Let's say I went like, mid to late on the first piece of legislation. I don't really want to speak mid to late again on the other piece of legislation, or you're kind of shaky in terms of how you're going to perform on that second piece of legislation. I would 100%, like give the sponsorship so I can get my thoughts out there. And then I still have that time for refutation, for weighing and things in my final appeal. And I spoke like 2.5 times basically. And again, expanding the speaking time, expanding the time that we are in front of the judges, that we are talking, that we're showing them why we should be there, why we should win. Super huge, super critical. We should all have that. Um, so, take advantage of final appeal. Ooh, strategy. Sponsor first bill, get final appeal, and then speak mid to late on second piece of legislation. Um, you can just say this like the other thing to think about is speaking position. This doesn't just have to apply to Harvard. This can apply to other tournaments that you're in as well. It's always good to kind of spread out your presence. What do I mean by that? That means that like ideally speaking, you are giving kind of like an early to mid speech on the first bill, and then on the second bill, probably something that is like mid to maybe late. The reason being is because I'm a really big proponent of the idea that you leave a lasting impression on the judge if you are one of the first people that they see giving a wonderful first impression. And if at the end of the round, you're one of the last people that they see closing the round really strong and really just showing that you're super dynamic. I can survive in the early round. I know how to do refutation in the late round. That's a strategy I really, really love. So I would put here for first uh for first legislation speak maybe like 2 3 4 um and then for second legislation you can speak maybe like 5 6 7. These are kind of like the sweet spots in my opinion. And Harvard is this exception to the rule because you get the sponsorship, so I'll just include sponsorship there. And let's like make that super noticeable so that is sponsor. And let's color code this as well. There we go. So yeah, this is kind of just like general legislation speaking strategy, in my opinion. Very good to spread out your presence. Because like for example, if you're going on a legislation and you give like, I don't know, like first bill, you speak like second to last, and then you speak like second cycle on second bill. If you have a really good performance, I like you should be very fine. Like I've done this before. I've seen other debaters done this before, but there's a risk to it, and that is just like you kind of get the judges in this like middle zone, which is harder to be remembered by. Unless your speaking is really good, unless your case is really good. But just generally speaking, I think spreading out those positions, trying to stay out of the middle as much as possible is super good. Because if we're being honest, judge attention span on a piece of legislation starts to drop off a little bit after kind of like this, fourth cycle, things like that. Um, and then again, starting up on another piece of legislation, you know, you can start really strong. Their attention's probably there. We just had recess, we just had a break, but maybe the debate goes on for a while and then you kind of just get lost in the sauce if you're like in the middle. So that's the strategy I recommend. It's not like a must have. It's not like a, oh, you're cooked if you don't go for this, but that's just something that I have to put out there. So yeah, do I have anything to speak on in terms of pre-strategy rules? I don't think so. Hmm. Competition day ends at, yeah, that is not happening. Like no Harvard tournament has ever ran on time in terms of scheduling. Maybe we'll start now. I hope so, but that's not happening. Um, and then just like other general pieces of advice. Get sleep the night before rounds. This is huge. You need to have energy. Prep before the tourney. There's no reason to be prepping in round, or doing anything like that. Um, do your prep in advance. It's just simple. It's smart. And then bring energy in your performance. Talked about this in my most recent Ascend Academy lecture. And by the way, if you haven't, yet, join Ascend Academy. It's completely free, lectures every single month, hours and hours of content. And if you haven't joined already, you can join and still get access to previous recordings as well. It's a free resource. Anyone can join. You should join Ascend Academy. But I was talking about this in my most recent lecture about aura. And that was just the super key idea of you need to have some kind of energy in your performance. And energy takes a bunch of different forms. Energy could be like, I'm really happy. I'm really enthusiastic. Energy could also be passionate. It became wanting to change things. Energy can appear in rhetoric, and it could also appear in refutation when you're just bringing some kind of uplifted tone, maybe a little bit faster, but something to like wake up yourself and the judges as well. Don't go overly fast and spread. Don't yell at them, but bring some kind of energy. Like I think I can recommend to everyone is like watch the way like a head coach gives a speech. I think if you watch the way like any head coaches, whether it be like the NFL, probably more likely the NFL, college football especially. Look at the way a coach rallies the team, rallies the troops, and gets them really hyped up and ready for like a game in a moment. That's the kind of like mindset that you should have of I'm not just here to like dilly dally, like give my speech and go home, sit down. I'm there to bring something new to the table, and I'm there because I am very enthusiastic. I'm very eager to share and educate this judge of something that I learned and something that I researched. Right? Yes, you're not going to care about all pieces of legislation the same way, but that is the kind of mindset that I think you should have if you really want to approach this kind of like tournament and put your best foot forward. That is like my best advice. Okay. Any questions? Let me check the chat real quick. Anything? Nope. Don't see anything. Let's see what we're at on time. Okay, we're not bad. Okay, we're doing pretty good. No questions. Okay, cool. Now let's go into talking about some of the pieces of legislation. Um, I think what I'll do is I'll kind of like put out the pieces of legislation on this doc. I'll give some kind of just like general overview and thoughts, and then I'll go into kind of like a sample of this is how I would research, this is how I prepare for a round, for prepping, for things like that, and just like what is the steps that I take to plan ahead for the round, either both round vision, prepping, or just like things in that general direction. So let's look at this first bill, the Haitian Recovery Act. Um, I don't know if this is a one for one repeat, but this has definitely been debated. I'm pretty sure this has been debated at Harvard before because this was debated my senior year prelims of Harvard. And this is just like what I mean by recycling legislation. Like, yes, it's foreign policy, so the situation has changed. There's been different sort of, you know, adaptations, new circumstances that have emerged in the world. Especially because when I debated, we there was a different president than what we have now. But with that being said, I'm not the biggest fan of this because if you're doing all of this without, the world has changed, the legislation should probably change and adapt as well to be, similar to that. So let's talk about the Haitian Recovery Act. Um, the United States shall allocate $1 billion to support Haiti in restoring stability, strengthening its national police force, and addressing urgent humanitarian needs for the purposes of this bill. Following terms will be defined. And I'll just 100 million earmarked for enhancing. Okay. Um, Off of like doing like very little like research aside from just like things that I've looked up in the past. I would automatically lean to probably saying this is probably neg-sided. Um, the reason why I say this is neg-sided is because for one, a lot of money. I know we've given aid to Haiti in the past before. I don't know if it's been to this extent, but the other reason why I say the neg on this is probably more likely is because kind of going off this idea that the bill is old, that like we are suggesting something that was also suggested a couple years ago. And if the situation hasn't changed and hasn't gotten better, I don't know how much more effective this is going to be. The other thing is, you can't find very many judges or just like Americans in general that would agree to something like this. And especially if you take into context the the circumstances that have happened in Venezuela, if you could take into context a lot of just like the uncertainties in Latin America or even US, military presence across the world, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you are not going to find a lot of people that will agree to deploy US troops in a foreign country to, yes, assist in training, but still, that's a lot of personnel. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but I'm probably going to lean neg sided on this. And the reason being is the other thing that I'll say is, just read the news headlines because a lot of what I'm basing my thoughts off of is just me doing like, basic reading of the New York Times briefing or Apple News or going to like the Annenberg Media Center, which is here at USC, and just like looking at the board of news that they have or just talking to different classmates and things like that. But if you don't know, the I believe the US embassy in Haiti was either evacuated like last year, I'm not completely sure. Or there was like recent kind of like, fighting around it. So wait, let me look at US embassy Haiti under attack. I'm not gonna read that. 2025. Yeah, exchange fire with Marines protecting US embassy in Port-au-Prince. Yeah, like already it's not looking super good for us. And I'll go into this in more depth, but it's looking like this legislation isn't going to work out. Compound that with the fact that USAID doesn't really exist. I don't know how we're going to do this. I would advise against running a neg case that says, "Oh, USAID doesn't exist, so like who's going to get the aid to them?" That seems like a very like weak kind of argument to make. I wouldn't like trust it the most. Um, and on top of that, like even if USAID doesn't exist, like yes, we can still get aid to them, but also that doesn't prove that there's a negative harm of the legislation. So remember, let me just like kind of put general notes up here for people that prep negation speeches. Remember, it is not enough to say that this legislation is unideal, you must prove that it will be actively harmful and cause more bad things to happen. That is what you have to keep in mind anytime that you are prepping a negation speech. The reason being is because, like, if you say that this is unideal, that is the equivalent of like complaining. Um, like I'll give you an example. I had a friend, still friends with him now. Actually, he goes to UCLA currently. In middle school, we used to play like video games together. We used to play Minecraft. We used to play Minecraft. This was before Discord. We would call each other on Skype and play Minecraft. But if you know anything about Skype, the mic filtering is really bad, so you can hear a lot of the noise that comes behind you. And every time this guy would have soccer practice, like his mom would be calling him for soccer practice, like, it's time to go to soccer practice, like, stop playing video games. Go in the car right now. Why aren't your shoes on? Why aren't your shin guards on? And he would always be like, no, like, no, I don't want to go. Like, I don't want to. I want to do something else. Like, I don't want to go to soccer practice. That is the equivalent of saying that this legislation is unideal or like there's not enough funding, or something like that, right? Because if you are just complaining, that isn't a good enough reason to not do something because then the affirmation will stack evidence on you and just be like, okay, cool complaint, but I have evidence that this will work. Cool complaint, but like if you think about it and we try really hard and the aid gets to them, this is the benefit that's going to happen. Whereas instead, if you are taking this approach, and if my friend, for example, were to say something like, "No, I can't go to soccer practice because last time I got kicked really hard in the leg and my leg is about to break, like my leg hurts," something like that. Like that would be a lot more effective because he is proving a harm of going to soccer practice. If he goes to soccer practice, he will get hurt, he will get harmed, things like that. That's the same thing that you should do when you approach negation speeches. You are not just proving that this is an ideal, you're proving that by taking this action, something bad happens, that harm happens. Not just that this is an ideal, but this is actively detrimental to the current situation. So yeah, just keep that in mind. The other bill that I'll take a look at, a bill to ban the use of AI in ICE and Border Patrol. I would say that this bill is probably half-sided. Couple reasons for this. Reason being is because already, like, with everything that surrounds ICE, with the controversy, with a lot of just the mismanagement and mispractices that they have done, it is going to be super hard to say, like, yes, that they should still be able to have, like, artificial intelligence and these extra tools and utilities. Because the general sentiment in America is ICE is doing too much right now. Giving them a lot of this power that they have through AI is probably going to be very harmful. And just generally speaking, not my political take or anything, the speech and debate sort of like world and like judges tends to be more liberal. That's just kind of like a fact of it. Not to say that there aren't conservative judges out there, but tends to be a more liberal event, liberal activity. Um, but I think the negation strength is going to be able to lie in the restriction of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. So I think just based off of RIP, based off the first look, first glance, zero research being done again, probably going to be AF-sided. And if not AF-sided, then bare minimum, you will encounter a lot of debaters that will go AF, and this will definitely be at least an AF-heavy debate, in my opinion. Could be wrong about that. Maybe more research will reveal something later, but we'll go into that in just a little bit. So let's mark that down as half-sided. Okay. What is the next bill? A bill to aid Egypt. This is not too much in my line of expertise, actually. I know that there was a similar bill about Egypt debated at Emory, I believe. But I think this is different from that one. So the United States shall hereby donate and deliver 400 million in humanitarian aid to the citizens of Egypt through Egypt's maritime border with Saudi Arabia. U.S. troops will be allotted as necessary to deliver the aid to USDOS as a representative of the border. Okay, cool. Let's just put this down first. Don't know too much. I wonder if there's any controversy surrounding Egypt right now. Egypt humanitarian aid. Gaza's Rafah border crossing with Egypt to reopen. Yeah, I know about this from the border between basically kind of like Egypt and like the Gaza Strip slash Israel area finally being opened up. Crossing with Egypt. I don't know if this is directly related to like aiding that situation or something else. Um, Conditionals probably better than the Haiti bill. The reason being is because when you put out a number like 1,000, that's like a commitment. That's a lot of numbers already. This is something that's like can be more flexible. Um, for now, let's put half-sided. Um, the reason being is because without further research, I don't think that there's anything right now that sticks out to me as terribly bad about giving this aid. I know, like, probably the neg is going to default to something like, oh, aid gets intercepted, aid gets corrupted. But if you have, U.S. troops, U.S. oversight, and like humanitarian things and stuff like that, probably hard to extort that. There's nothing sort of like outward revealing about a neg case right now, or a reason to not pass this. Okay. Bill to halt the expansion of United States ICBMs. I don't know if we've debated this before, but I've seen something like this. Um, what would I say about this? Yeah, I would go neg on this. The reason being is because one, if you consider like just debates in general or geopolitics, like Russia and China are building their ICBMs. If we stopped ourselves, they would definitely not stop themselves. Like China has showed no sign of stopping. So would just based off of that, remember you are a congressperson, you are a legislator. Your job is to think of what is that the American people like want slash need. What do they need to be protected? And I can guarantee you that if you are going to speak as an American legislator, you have to look at this and say, why should China have something protecting them or as a weapon that we, the United States, do not have? Like, not to go in too far into it to like get it right off of rip, but like maybe I can agree with stopping the expansion, but replacement is really weird in my opinion because if you think about ICBMs, we have old ones that are probably not as effective, or it takes a lot of money to, upkeep them, or it takes a lot of like, um, personnel in order to take care of it, which is also a safety hazard. Like, why not replace the old thing with a new thing that is probably a lot safer, and a lot less expensive? Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I would say like this is neg-sided. Um, yeah. What else? A bill to promote artificial intelligence education in schools. Are already leaning AF on this. Education bills like this are really hard to go neg on, in my opinion. The reason being is because if you look at this legislation, like who is going to say no to like developing AI curriculum in schools? Like, why shouldn't we teach students, kids, elementary, middle, high school, like how to properly use artificial intelligence, how to properly like navigate the AI world, or like learn about like, deepfake information, things like that. When I was in elementary school, I think this was the first time that they started integrating like what's it called? Like education or like digital curriculum into the things that we learn. And for context, like I didn't go to like a fancy elementary school or anything. I went to like a Title I elementary school that was, luckily able to receive a lot of like grants and funding from like the government. But one of the things that they were teaching us in fourth grade is just like the basics of like this is a digital footprint, things that you say will be left out there. There's a lot of dangerous people on the internet and things like that. And to have that for AI, it feels kind of weird to say to know something to a legislation like this. Just to give y'all something to think about as I move through these, if you wanted to think about a possible neg case, um, it would probably lie in maybe the private sector can be bad. Maybe you can have like a funding shortage argument, but that's probably like a lot of the only neg angles or neg grounds that I can think of. Um, American Drilling Reform Act. This is drilling oil operations. This is honestly probably the most two-sided piece of legislation that we have here that I've crossed. Like this is pretty balanced in my opinion. I'll actually give it a score of balance. Um, and the reason being is because if you look at a lot of legislation that is about like green energy, green technology, and things like that, like I love debating over topics of green energy, green tech, and innovation, divestment from fossil fuels into things like that. Um, a lot of this is about research. A lot of it is about the numbers that you run. So like for example, the affirmation's obviously going to be like, oh, this is good for transitioning to green renewable energy. This would reduce pollution. This is really good at switching over and things like that. And just like if we want to be able to rely on green renewable energy, we should be pursuing this legislation. We should, pass something like this. But meanwhile, the negation has actually a lot of different angles to run on this. They could look at this piece of legislation and, based off of the numbers, they could say, hey, this is actually, yeah, like this is a good idea, but this is like very bad for workers or for people right now, or for Americans. Like we're not, built for this situation. And that was actually like the case or slash like the argument framework or structure that I would run on a lot of like green tech bills. I did this Harvard finals on a bill about carbon tax. And I did this in national finals on a bill about carbon capture, where especially in the carbon tax one, it's like I didn't deny that this was a good idea. Like I'm like, yeah, carbon tax should probably exist. But the thing that I pointed out is the numbers don't check out. Where if you pass this legislation now, so many Americans are going to have to pay so much more for their energy just to keep the lights on, just to keep the power running, or even to just like what's the word for it, or like to drive to work to like power their cars and things like that. That it really doesn't make sense to set a carbon tax at a number this high. Kind of went for a similar slash different approach in national finals when I was debating the carbon capture legislation, where I honestly outright pointed like, oh, carbon capture is not viable because I think the legislation would divest everything from fossil fuels and only put in carbon capture. And I'm just like, carbon capture is good, but it's not that good. Like we've honestly had it since like the technology's existed since like I think like the 60s or the 70s, and it's not been able to do much for us. As a matter of fact, if you look at what carbon capture does right now, a majority of like the carbon that is like captured in the atmosphere actually goes into pumping oil out of the ground in terms of they use it to like push oil out of like caves and like crevices and stuff like that. And yes, it can be turned into electricity, but not a lot of it is. So this is legislation that I will mark as balanced, and this is something that y'all would probably have to research, like based off of these numbers. Is this something that Americans could live with or not? So yeah, balanced. Um, minimum wage for incarcerated individuals. Again, this is a bill I'd say like Avon, like just off of first glance versus off first like look, um, because yeah, if you like just for some context, you look at the state of like the prison system right now, where some prisoners aren't given proper wages and things like that. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say, yeah, like I don't want prisoners to be paid properly for their wages because like at the end of the day, they're still in prison. Like they can spend it, I guess, on like commissary, like in the prison, or maybe they can just save it and they'll have money, if when they leave or if they eventually leave. And if you just think about it from this standpoint, like it's probably better to pay them properly and make sure that they have everything that they need to kind of just like get their life started if when they exit prison and things like that. Because just putting it out there, if you're a prisoner that, you did a bunch of work in prison, but you leave, now you have no money, you have nothing to start with, it just becomes a lot easier to turn back to some of these old, habits or old practices that are, bad, illegal, and or harmful. As on the other hand, if you have money, if you have some income to kind of like work off of, it's a lot easier to get, your life back started. And this kind of just goes back to the idea that like prison should be a place for rehabilitation. Like that is not just like my opinion or like, the idea of it. Like, yes, it should be for like, reflection, I guess, punishment. But if we're not rehabilitating prisoners and we're releasing them, they're eventually going to go back to prison. So it doesn't make too much sense, in my opinion, to not pay them a fair minimum wage for whatever work it is they're doing. Because it says cooking, cleaning, etc. here, but there's actually like a lot more tasks and things that they do. I think there was like an article released in California that prisoners played a role in like fighting like wildfires, and it's crazy to think about that, like a prisoner's going out there and like fighting wildfires and things like that. So I think if they're doing that kind of work, probably should, get properly compensated. I would find it hard, you know, to envision a lot of people saying like, yeah, no, like don't pay them properly if they're doing, X, Y, and Z. So I'll mark that down as app sided. Okay. A bill to recognize the Republic of Somaliland as an independent nation. I honestly say this might be a little bit balanced as well, but not in the way that actually let me move this. Um, but not in the way that this bill is balanced. The reason why I say that is because when it comes to foreign policy legislations, excuse me, when it comes to foreign policy legislations, it is a lot harder to find evidence of things like this, and this honestly has to do with a lot of past precedent, a lot of like history research, and a lot of just looking into like making your best sort of educated guess and or argument slash like warrant for what we will see in the future. To give kind of like a TLDR on this situation, um, basically there's a Somaliland is a group slash nation that does not have its own sovereignty, that is not internationally recognized, and it is a bunch of different ethnic groups that were basically in Somalia, kind of left, created their own thing, and they are essentially kind of like a nation without like complete sovereignty or independence is I would say the best way to think of it. Um, so now we're going to recognize them, set up things like an embassy, give them an embassy as well, and recommend that other nations would recognize them. Um, Bills like this are kind of hard because the idea is like, yes, recognizing them is important. And if you do your research, you would look at like, oh, there's been a lot of ethnic discrimination that's happened against them. That's why Somaliland like formed, or like that's why people are trying to advocate for the formation of Somaliland. But at the same time, if the United States is taking a stance and going up to Somalia and saying, hey, like this is not yours anymore, Somaliland is its own independent place, might cause some conflicts within itself. Now, do I think Somalia is going to fight the United States in terms of saying like, "Oh no, like we are going to go to war," um, like we're gonna go to war over this, like we are going to like fight you and stuff like that? Like, no, not particularly. I don't think that is something that like they're gonna go and do. However, I think that there is a lot of harm when historically speaking the United States says, "Hey, we're gonna support you, we're gonna recognize you," and then we don't follow up with humanitarian aid, we don't follow up with assistance, and then that starts to cause a crisis where it's like, sure, you recognize them, but what is the actual help that you're giving to Somaliland? Like, what is it that they're going to see with this? So, if I had to give some advice, the affirmation wins by proving that after recognition, there's like a long-term plan to support the people of Somaliland, that there's a long-term plan to support what it is that they're doing and make sure that the country slash like this nation doesn't crumble and isn't getting infringed upon by Somalia. If I'm on the negation, I would prove that like the United States can do this, but if we have no commitment, we have no follow up. Here's the harms that there's going to happen. There can be more ethnic discrimination. Somalia would eventually be like, okay, like why'd you do this for? And maybe this jeopardizes different things that we're operations we're doing in Somalia, different sorts of trade ventures that we're trying to do. Think of the repercussions that surround this if it's not a fully thought out plan. Because I think if you ask any judge, um, what is the issue with American military intervention or foreign policy, they're going to tell you is that America too often has a tendency to go in and do things without a plan, right? When America goes in and does things with a plan, things tend to work out. But as we've seen, like when we are getting involved militarily, when we're getting involved with force, things don't tend to work out the best. or the greatest. And that's just kind of just like how things have shaped out. So I'll call this balanced. Um, in my opinion, maybe lean neg. The reason why I say lean neg is because I tend to believe that high schoolers are bad at writing foreign policy. And that is just because, like, one, high schoolers aren't the best at domestic policy, first and foremost. And now to talk about foreign policy, I would say, like, unless you are, from that region of the world or have directly dealt with this crisis on face to face, probably not going to have the best knowledge of it. Um, Probably going to make assertions that aren't, like the truest. And in my opinion, I think it takes more than a 3-minute speech to unpack an issue like this and like the things that can fall out from it. So that's just my take on it. Probably lean neg for now. Um, what else are we on right now? That was the last prelim one. Okay, so now we're on 2 quarters. Sanction Qatar. This came up before. Quarters. Um, and if you have any questions throughout this, yeah, feel free to type it in the chat. Like I'll go and look over it. So let's do quarters. And this is quarters part 1. Actually, I don't need to write that. The United States federal government shall sanction Qatar or Qatar and by limiting all forms of trade conducted with Qatar until improvements are made regarding human rights in Qatar. Improvements include but are not limited to providing safe working conditions, eliminating gender segregation, and terminating persecution of the LGBTQ plus community. Sanctions are defined as economic and trade restrictions placed on a country. Human rights are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other protected status. Ensuring the protection of these rights, the DOS and DOC will be in charge of enforcement by limiting all forms of trade. Okay. Let's unpack this one a little bit more deeply, considering that it is a outround bill. What was I gonna say? Yeah. So for some context, you may have seen this before, and if you have seen this before, this was because this was really highlighted in the 2022 World Cup. It is crazy to think that we are 4 years later than that from that because I remember watching the World Cup in class with Aditya. We were in Henderson's, like we would watch the World Cup like almost every day instead of learning, and then like we would come in and lunch and watch that as well. It's crazy to think it's 4 years later. um but to get more to the point here, a lot of the stadiums that were built in Qatar for the World Cup were built specifically for the World Cup and built on limited time, and a lot of the stadiums were built using basically slave labor, where it was just a lot of migrants from different countries, particularly like Southeast Asia, or Africa. They would be, they would essentially go to Qatar because there's a promise of a job, a promise of sending money. They can get a wage, send money back home to their families and things like that. But the wages weren't up to snuff. They were kept in terrible conditions. And besides that, Qatar also has like different persecutions of marginalized individuals in their country. That being said, this legislation now seeks to sanction them by limiting all forms of trade that we conduct with Qatar until improvements are made regarding human rights in the region. And because I'm going a little bit more in depth in this, I think this is where I can give an example of what I think your prep research process should look like. So let me put this up here. You are doing research wrong if you're not starting your research with the 5 W's and the H, the who, what, when, where, why, and then how. Yeah, 5 W's and then an H. You should be able to answer every single one of these questions before you start prepping. Why should you be able to do this? It is because if you are able to answer every single one of these questions, you have an understanding of why the legislation is created and what we are essentially talking about, right? In my opinion, there's no reason why you should not begin prep with this process, most especially if you don't know what the legislation is talking about, right? If you've been doing this since like your freshman year and now you're a senior, maybe you have some leeway, but I will say Adrian Beck, He did this throughout his entire career. Vincent Nguyen did this throughout his entire career. Like, if they can perform at that high level, if they're runner up at TOC, winning the leadership bowl, winning tournaments and things like that. If they're doing these things, there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing it as well to prepare yourself for these situations. So fill this out, and it should typically like fill out a page, if not half a page. You should be understanding who is this bill talking about slash who is involved, what is happening currently, when has this been done before, when will this pledge happen, same thing as where has this been done before, where will this happen, why was this happening slash why is this the suggested plan of action, and then a simple how, like how is this legislation going to accomplish this slash how was this addressed before. Yes, they seem kind of redundant. That's part of the point. Like, the idea is that when you are going through your prep, if you are able to successfully answer all these questions, you are essentially giving yourself the crash course, the history on whatever this bill is, whatever this topic is, right? And if we just like go in and look at this, right, who is this bill talking about slash who is being involved? Well, obviously, like the United States, Qatar, um, people in Qatar as well. And then maybe like on the outskirts, you can say like, US people post-trade sanctions. And then you also have your other actors. So just think of this as like stakeholders. Stakeholders slash people involved. US people post-trade sanctions. What is currently happening, like we talked about, and you should go to the web and find this. Human rights abuses. We can gather that from the legislation, and we should do more research. When has this been done before in terms of legislative action? When will this legislation take place is one we can answer. January 1st, 2027. So next year. Where has this been done before slash where will this happen? Sanctions from US. But in terms of sanctions themselves, we'll have to look that up. Why was this happening? In terms of why for human rights abuses, building infrastructure, I think that's how you spell it. Building infrastructure slash other problems. In terms of why is this the suggested plan of action, we'll have to look at that. Trade, ... And then how is this legislation going to accomplish that? Obviously, sanctions. Okay, so let's go and do some of our research. Who is involved? So let's just look up, like, very simple, Qatar human rights, crisis. What can we find? Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, boom, like 3 already good sources. We can also go to news like 3 days ago. That is beautiful. Not the situation that's happening, but the fact that we found that source. Yeah, migrant workers' rights. Still struggle to change jobs either. Monthly minimum wage is about 274 documented. The other thing that you can do when you're researching is also like click on these links that people provide, or they will link to other things that will give you the information that you need, that you want. Here, more information as well. And like things like this, like we can honestly just take and we can copy paste into our document. And always remember to include links. So in case you want to cite it in your speech, you would have this right here, Human Rights Watch World Report 2026. So where can we, oh, throw in an extra space. I don't like that. Okay. When was this published? Maybe it was just for the year. No, it was 3 days ago. We can say 2-4-2020. And then always link your evidence, please. Because in case you get evidence challenge, which I think is pretty rare, like you have it there, you can click on it. Things like that. Yep. It's part of the what is currently happening. So these can honestly be folded. Yeah, other things here that we've seen before. What are else? So honestly, yeah, you can also leave a note that there's like more to article regarding who is affected. As just a reminder to yourself that like both the who and the what are being affected and talked about in this article. Okay, yeah. Now let's look into more specifics of understanding things like trade. So it's like what can we US trade with Qatar. Cool numbers here. I think I would like to know specifically what we are trading. So what is currently happening? So that's human rights abuse. So this is trade. Also, Calibri is the only font you should be using to prep. You use anything else, you're prepping wrong. Catalytic products. Well, interesting. This makes sense. We have air bases there, but Okay, so I've been quiet for a little bit, but just to walk y'all through what I'm doing. Again, it's kind of just like a rinse and repeat process of I'm trying to just gather information that is relevant to me, right? I want to know what is being talked about in terms of the what of human rights abuses and the what of the trade that we are doing. I'm also trying to find out when this legislation slash action has been done before. If I'm correct, which I'm pretty sure that I am, like we've never sanctioned Qatar before. Like, there's also another reason why we haven't sanctioned Qatar before, it's because we have a lot of air bases there. So U.S. air bases, Qatar. The main U.S. air base in Qatar is this one, and it is the headquarters of U.S. Central Command. Again, don't just read the AI overview. Actually, like look for it. So, what else can we find here in this article that was from this year? Nothing here. This was as a result of the Iran thing. But let's see if it has information that we have. Reducing the number of personnel from the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, U.S. Trump considers whether to take action against Iran. So, what is this air base? Let's just make sure that we are right. That is, Central Command. Yeah. Al Udeid to enhance integrated defense, CENTCOM commander. All you did, yeah, like this air base is like super important to us. But we can also just look at air bases in Qatar map. I think there was a map that had it. Actually, let's see. I don't trust that. Qatar. There's a graphic from CBS. I trust this. Um, yeah, showing some key things. What else do we have here? um, 10,000, and that's our military personnel. Also, if you look at this graphic, it says Al Udeid Air Base is the largest U.S. base in the region. I think this is a big part of the reason why we haven't sanctioned them before. No, because look at this. And that is just, yeah, we can just like put the graphic or information. 10,000 U.S. personnel. All you did is largest airbase in the region. That's probably pretty important. It's also U.S. Central Command Center, which for the Middle East, probably pretty important. Where is this happening? Obviously Qatar slash like where will this happen? What will this affect? Um, Now that we have like that information, we can start to form basically a lot, better ideas of what we should look at or what we should go for, right? Because, who is this bill talking about? US, Qatar, people in Qatar, like things like that. What is currently happening? Human rights abuses of women, of LGBTQ plus peoples, of migrants, especially, and things like that. Um, and what else is included in our what? Well, let's also look at what is being traded. Look at all these numbers in terms of goods. But if we get more specific, aircraft parts, gliders, balloons, reaction and catalytic parts, why might we be putting this there? Well, maybe because we have a really big air base and they also want to have weapons and military of their own. And when has this been done before? We haven't done something like this before to Qatar. Like if we look at this article, because we have a big U.S. air base, and it sounds like if you want a nation to host a U.S. air base, you don't sanction them and things like that. Which coincides with where has this been done before? We could honestly expand a little bit bigger. So U.S. sanction countries for human rights abuses. Let's see if there's information here. Well, there's a big list. Maybe we should get specific. I think specifically U.S. allied countries we should look at. We have a sanctions tracker. Wow. Ooh, wait, I know what this is talking about. We'll find the card for this, but not that we've sanctioned a country, but we limited slash did not renew Saudi Arabian arms sales when they were using human rights in Yemen. This I know. Ending all Americans war. This ban follows similar moves. Their US justification size met their end of the deal for free to meet ours. Yep. This is what I was looking for. So I think why it worked this time, and we can get into that as well. Okay. Direct sanctions. Why was this happening? We answered this question as well with our source up here. And how is this legislation going to accomplish that? Sanctions. So, like I talked before, kind of going through this right now just because I don't want to make this too long and, there's limited time that we have right now. But this is the kind of approach that you should have for the research process for your prep to get started thinking of this is how I can come up with different arguments. This is how I understand the background of a legislation and go to the approach from there. So, what did we learn from sort of like this research right now? One, we learned about the different human rights abuses that are happening. Two, we learned about what the US is currently trading with them. Three, we dove a little bit deeper into this and understood, well, it's no wonder we're having them. And why haven't we done anything yet? Well, it's because they house the largest airbase that we have, as well as 10,000 US personnel as well. At the same time, we have also looked to, like, have we tried sanctions before? Have we done something like that? Not sanctioned strictly, but something similar in Saudi Arabia when Biden limited the weapons that were given to Saudi Arabia, or did not renew the agreement until they agreed to be better on human rights practices in the region. Why was this happening? Why is this abuse happen? Again, answered before. A lot of it had to do with the building of stadiums, but all other parts of it have to do with kind of just like different like rules within the country itself. And how is this legislation going to accomplish these change sanctions? So again, this doesn't give you a full argument yet, but this is the research start that you should have anytime that you're looking at something. And of course, plugging in our sources, making sure we have all this good information or things like that, right? But what can we immediately start thinking of because after doing this research? Well, on the app, we can say that there's, actually, let's start with the Starting with an egg, what do we know? We rely on them to house a major U.S. U.S. airbase. What can we look at though numbers wise? Kind of does look like we are, giving a lot to Qatar. We are, exporting a lot to them, and it seems to be almost even. But as you can see, there's like a trade surplus with them, so we're kind of winning on that end. But the other thing is to point out is that they have a major airbase. We rely on them for that. I don't know if we necessarily rely on them for trade. We have never had blanket sanctions like this on Qatar, and dare I say other also not particularly also not really on major US allies, especially ones helping our military, especially not ones helping our military ventures and things like that. And yeah, that like I think that's like a lot of what you can base your neg off of. So without doing too much thinking, without doing too much neg specific research, we can already come up with this idea that okay, it might not be a good thing to pass this legislation, or it might not be effective because one, they can retaliate against us by limiting our access to our major US airbase. We've also never done sanctions like this, so there's no saying that it has worked, it can work before. And also another thing that, I can think of, which could be possible, is you should also, maybe do some research and look at how much is Qatar reliant on US products and US goods and things like that. Because then you can work from there and say something along the lines of, oh, this is like maybe Qatar is really reliant on US goods and other things like that. And if they are sanctioned, instead of just like immediately complying, maybe they then take that out on these affected minority groups even more. And let's say, like, just throwing this out there, don't know if it's true, US exports things like supplies and shirts, or like hygiene products and things like that, and then all of a sudden we're going to sanction them, we're not going to like have this trade anymore, we're going to make it really hard to get US products, and instead of getting Qatar to act, they would just punish like migrant groups and minorities even more. Could be a possibility. Yeah, though, we can work off of this idea that, like, one, just good to stand up for human rights abuses, stand up again, not for, against good to stand up against human rights abuses. We can also say they are very reliant on us for trade, dare I say protection. Um, so that's something that, can signify that we, the United States, have leverage in this situation. And the other thing to consider and think about is we have some past precedent, not necessarily of sanctions, but of limiting sort of like military supplies and assistance in that, in that respect, in that regard. And if we consider, this evidence that we had before, that is, Qatar relies on a lot of imports for things like aircraft parts, catalytic parks, and commodities not found in the region and things like that. Like, we can honestly make an argument that if it is true that Qatar is reliant on us for defense, they'd much rather listen and make changes instead of doing nothing. We saw something similar in the Saudi Arabia Yemen situation. I really like this. I think this is key. I think this convinces, not convinces, but this has me saying app-sided, app-leaning, because based off of this sort of just like preliminary research into this legislation, into this topic, it's looking like you can have an app angle that's really based off of this idea that if it is true that Qatar is reliant on us for defense, on military and weapons, sure, the negation is going to say like, oh, they'll limit like air base like access, oh, they're not going to let us operate and things like that. But an AF case builds this idea that Qatar is a lot more reliant on us. Or like, yeah, maybe it's mutual, but they really, really need us. And why are they going to like, be petty and say like, oh, we're not going to like improve human rights abuses. We're going to continue being bad, instead of just making some simple reforms and simple changes and still getting like the assistance and the help of the United States. Also, keep in mind in situations like this, like maybe it might be different with this administration, but typically speaking, if we speak on human rights and say we want this change to happen, we'll also probably do something to say like, oh, maybe some aid will be given to, help the situation, things like that. But past precedents, past precedents, past precedents. That's what wins foreign policy debates. That's what wins almost all debates, like in general. If you can point to a time in history, a time in the past where this happens, and say this happened before, this can happen again, that's going to be do really solid for you. And that's what I really like about this Saudi Arabia evidence, where when the Biden administration withheld renewing contracts for weapons, withheld just giving, arms to Saudi Arabia, saying, unless you change these human rights practices, you're not going to get this back or we're not going to renew it. Saudi Arabia then like went and acted accordingly. And I think using that example, again, different countries, but it is probably the closest thing that we've seen to this legislation where you argue by sanctioning them and limiting things like trade of military technology, which it seems that they're really reliant on, instead of just wanting to give up that, they'll want to comply and work with us instead. Of course, in a lot of these debates, you have those neg arguments that are like, oh, they can turn to Russia, oh, they can turn to China. Um, don't know how much I believe that. Like, yes, I'm sure they get weapons from them, but honestly, we can throw that out there as well. Let's change this of like turn to foreign countries slash can move on from us. Those are some things to get you started, but this is kind of like the research process that you should be going after, looking at for past precedent, looking at times this has happened before, and doing all of this will get you set up really, really, really nicely, just for having a good case to work off of. If not a good case, it is a much easier start to your research, and it doesn't have to take super long either. So yeah, move on from that. Say that is half-sided. And let's clear these. And let's move this back. Half-sided. So returning back to kind of like an intermission intersection to understand research and flowing and things like that. Do your best to answer the who, what, when, where, why, how, find sources, and don't just immediately apply those sources as, oh, this is argument now. But that is what gets the ball rolling, and it should reveal what side is going to be stronger in this debate. And that's the ideal hope of like what you get from looking at a legislation, breaking it down, and seeing where it goes essentially. So what else do we have? A bill to invest in hypersonic missiles. Oh my goodness. This is another recycled piece of legislation, in my opinion. Um, Basically, here's my thoughts on hypersonic missiles, and I'll write this out as well. Let's actually just do some Googling and do some research. Hypersonic missile development US, right? Let's look at this. Defense Security Monitor. We could probably find a better source as well. Background: currently developing 3 hypersonic weapons programs. Navy's Conventional Strike, Army's Long Range, and Air Force's Hypersonic Attack Cruiser Missile. US must be highly accurate and reliable. Let's see if this takes us to a better source. Wow! Congressional Research Service /congress.gov. Like, the United States has actively pursued the development of hypersonic missiles that fly, since the early 2000s. Honestly, let's like go and put that on our prep board. Um, and then Congressional Research Service. Like, again, as it pertains to this, as it, relates to the situation, my thing about this legislation is hypersonic missile development is non-unique. What does that mean? It means that with or without this legislation, we are going to build and develop hypersonic missiles. So let's write this. What does this mean? This legislation, actually, no. Hypersonic missile development is non-unique. 。 it is not unique to this legislation. With or without this bill, we will be developing them. In my opinion, this is not true all the time, but as soon as you have found a sort of like in a case that this thing is non-unique, it becomes harder to find reasons why you should fail this legislation. It becomes harder to find a neg on this case. The reason being is because if you are able to take a look at this legislation and say, oh, with or without this legislation, we're gonna build it, so what's the harm? That limits the negations kind of like their scope of operations because they're no longer able to kind of not no longer, but it becomes a lot harder to say like, oh, hypersonic missiles themselves are bad, they should not be developed. Because even if this bill fails, we're still gonna obviously develop them. Like very clear that the US military wants them and things like that. Rather, you're probably gonna have to go for this different approach and either say on the neg, like, hey, they already have enough funding. We shouldn't give $10 billion more. Or maybe look at this and say, hey, we should probably spend more on testing, evaluation, and deployment, or we should probably spend more on, defense instead. But again, going back to what I said earlier about, these negation speeches, it feels more like complaining rather than saying like this is actively harmful to do. So my recommendation to any people trying to speak neg on this legislation is just look at this and do your best to point out, excuse me, what can this money be better spent on? What is it that this money can be spent on instead? And if we're spending more money than already exists on hypersonic missiles, what is money being taken away from? What can money be going towards instead? That is probably where the neg lies, where the strength lies. But I to any app speakers out there, I think there's no harm in starting the top of your speech just by saying like, hey, they're going to be developed or with or without this legislation. It's probably a good thing to invest even more in it because we can speed up production or we can spend more money into defense. And this is just introducing more money to make all of these problems of delayed development that the neg might be talking about not happen, or like this is just going to be developed a lot faster. Things like that. Okay. A bill to establish the Lithium Extraction and Development Lead Act. Due to recent discoveries of domestic lithium reserves and to combat China's monopoly on global lithium, the United States shall create a fund to offset initial mining costs, as well as creating a tax subsidy to incentivize businesses to mine domestic lithium and manufacture green technology that requires lithium domestically. Hmm. I think another numbers bill, pretty hard to say a particular side, which is why I'll probably lean AF on it. I think what I'll say is like I tend to lean default AF on a lot of bills that I don't have too much knowledge of, because especially when a bill is describing something new and something interesting and stuff like this, I'm like, oh yeah, like why is this a bad idea? I could spitball a couple of reasons why this might be a bad idea. I think one of them being is if you look at this and you say, well, what is the reason why, the United States, we produce like a lot of oil like within ourselves domestically, but like what is the reason why we don't necessarily like, use all of it or dig it all up, or why do we have an oil reserve and things like that? Well, it's because like it's still incredibly helpful to go out and get it from other sources. We have reserves, we hold on to our oil, we keep it valuable, things like that. But we also use it as well. Um, I would look into like how much of this domestic lithium reserve kind of exists, and is it enough? Where are we looking towards with this? Um, but again, unless you can prove that like we are never going to turn to this, it seems like pretty relevant to pass this legislation. I'm actually curious to see if this is another way that like another thing that we can non-unique. Wow, 2024. So this is quite. Oh my goodness, ads. I hate ads. I hate ads. We are not sponsored by Adobe. We are not sponsored. Lithium, EV batteries. Let's see. US to 3 days ago. Well, it sounds like here we are securing supply chains with um, foreign allies and things like that. Secure, yeah, looks interesting enough. We can like support a major private sector operation to strengthen U.S. critical mineral and battery supply chains. This is interesting. I don't know what it would be used for, but it should be kept here. The Loan Program Office. Let's deal with Lithium Americas Corp with the support of General Motors. Provide the U.S. government with 5% equity ownership in the form of LAC warrants, as well as an additional 5% ownership warrants, LPO warrants, collateral package on a loan, helping to reduce repayment risk for taxpayers. Despite some of the largest deposits, the unit produces less than 1% of the global supply of lithium. Production is going to skyrocket. So we can put, look at this later. Some effort is already being made to take advantage of lithium in America. The then question to answer is, what is this legislation doing differently? Specifically, what is Section 3A and B? What is Section 3A and 3B doing that is different? And is that different good or bad? This is actually an area where, because like this would take more research, but this is actually an area that I like in terms of you're not able to strictly non-unique it on the affirmation because there's a lot more detail being worked into the legislation. And to anyone that is planning on writing legislation, that is planning on proposing bills to tournament, because I know you will, and there's, tournaments, except for a couple, are going to have student submitted legislation. When you write bills, I like things like this where we are putting detail into the bill, right? Bills that are super general or really wide reaching in scope, those are the bills that is really easy to say app-sided, neg-sided, app-sided, neg-sided without doing very much research. But the more detail that you put into a bill and say, well, this is going to happen, however, this is going to happen, that is where like now a debate can happen. Ideally, the best bills are able to force debaters to, refute and weigh. But if you have a bill that is straight up just one-sided, it becomes a lot harder to do that. Um, so the reason why I say you can't strictly just like non-unique this and say, oh, with or without this legislation, we're going to do lithium mining. Maybe you could have that as response on the app. It is because you have to look at the current rules around lithium mining and see if these rules in section 3A, 3B, or not rules, but like funding is different than what's being provided. Um, do I have a good example of this? I actually do. Let's go back to this Haiti bill in prelim. One thing that you should know about this is we are not the only actors involved in Haiti. So remember what we were saying of, do your who, what, when, where, why, how. if you do this correctly for this prelim bill about Haiti, it should be easy to find or easy to reveal that the UN actually has a hand in trying to stabilize the situation that's happening in Haiti, working with other countries, getting them involved, trying to make sure that there's some sort of stabilization, going on to the nation, to the country, and things like that. So that is why you can look at a bill like that and you can say, yes, help and assistance is non-unique. It'll happen with or without this legislation. That is a situation where you don't necessarily have to say, "Oh, because help will come with or without this legislation, well, because help will come with or without this legislation, we should just pass and get ourselves involved because help is getting involved anyways. We should get involved." In this situation, it's valid to run an argument that says, wait, maybe we should wait for the UN to do their thing. Like maybe we should be the ones waiting for this UN course of action, this UN plan to stabilize Haiti, and then act afterwards and see what they're going to do from there. The reason why I like that argument, the reason why it works is because in this situation, we have different sort of like stakeholders or actors involved, right? We are putting US money, US funding, and US military on the line. So instead of running in and just like putting all of this out there, why don't we wait for the UN to do their thing? Maybe their plan works. They've worked with Haiti in the past. Maybe it's a lot better to go for it. And that's a good reason to fail this legislation because maybe if US troops get involved, there's more fighting like we already saw at the embassy. And going back to this bill about lithium extraction, maybe it's possible to argue the same thing where you're like, well, right now in the status quo, we actually just struck a deal to have more mining of lithium resources in America and have more private companies receive tax benefits and be involved by doing this thing. However, by passing this legislation, maybe this is a less than ideal tax credit, or maybe this 100 billion over 5 years isn't good, or like something in this legislation messes up, what already exists right now. Maybe Section 3A and Section 3 reveal that. I don't know. Probably going to have to take more research. Off of first glance, probably not. But look out for those things in this legislation. That's why I say Section 3A and Section 3B, probably where a neg might be able to find their case, or where an affirmation case can get a lot stronger and just say, like, this is where things can improve and get better, um, even more so than what already exists. So, okay. And let's move into the last quarters bill. And that is public option healthcare plan. Wow. I debated this in Harvard my senior year in Sems. Um, so absent. Funds drawn from the combination. Oh, actually. Okay. To give this a quick breakdown, I think this is actually pretty balanced. This can be balanced debate. Um, why do I say this is a balanced debate? One, I think when you look at public option healthcare debates, they tend to be pretty balanced. The reason being is because public healthcare option is something that is pretty popular with people, pretty popular with Americans. Why is that the case? Because people, that don't have healthcare right now, they want to have access to healthcare. But as opposed to just like a government only system, people that have private healthcare right now want to keep their private healthcare. Like I think that's like not too crazy to say that people who have private want to keep it, but people that don't have anything want a public option and want something to be there. I think this is kind of like the balance between the two, where someone doesn't have to give up, their private insurance to have a public option, to have public insurance out there. And that's where I think this is super crucial, and that's where I think this is super important because the app can have a very, very clear path to saying this is a good idea because if you are a private healthcare owner, you get to keep your private healthcare. But for people who are uninsured, let's finally give them an ability to get insured. And that's where you have Section 3C where there's like a maximum premium of $100, maximum premium of $200. Still probably relatively affordable compared to other like healthcare plans and options out there, especially if your state doesn't have a public healthcare plan. But that's where I think this is very good. Where I think the neg strength lies is in a couple things. One, you always have those classic neg arguments that are saying like, if we are going to expand the healthcare system, we are going to see more overworked and underpaid, nurses and doctors and things like that. There's a couple of reputations to that. I won't get into that fully, right now, but I think it's worth saying that logistically, there's going to be some growing pains, so to speak, especially in the near term, where there's going to be a lot of adjusting that has to happen on the end of healthcare workers and hospitals. The other thing that I find particularly interesting is how the funding is going to work for this legislation, where there's going to be funding drawn from the Department of Health and Human Services budget, as well as the federal reallocation of existing subsidies provided to private insurance plans under the Affordable Care Act. I think this could hurt people. I think that if you're on the neg, you should look to sections 3A and 3B as this place where you are going to live and grow your case. Because, yes, while we can fund it, if this is going to take away services or going to restrict people that, have some sort of private insurance, or maybe there's programs under the Department of Health and Human Services that might get axed and might get cut for the startup of this. And like I said, in the short term, there's going to be a lot of growing pains from this, where this might not necessarily work out or be the most um, feasible or logical thing to exist. So I'd say balance, maybe slight a lean on the AF, but I would use section 3A and section 3B if I was in it. Yep, if you're in the neg, you use section 3A and 3B to your advantage. And now let's speed run Sems and finals. Coming up on, I believe, almost 2 hours now. I don't want to take up, too much time or make this too long. Try to make this a little bit more consumable. And especially, don't want to create too much um, information to consume, so to speak. In terms of you can only sit through a stream or a YouTube video for so long before you start getting tired. I know I can, but let's look at some of these bills. So we have vote. We have Venezuelan migrants. I think this is also in the Stanford docket, which is happening right now, or as this is going live. Okay, let's go to the Vote Act. Mobile voting. Wow. Interesting. My thoughts and my breakdown. I think first and foremost, off the top of my head, the app side. Not saying you have to talk about this, but the app clash, the app side is going to talk about things like mobile voting is important because it increases accessibility to elections and things like that. It creates voting accessibility, makes it easier for people to participate in democracy and do things and stuff like that. On the neg, I think the neg strength lies in pointing out a lot of the technical challenges that would exist from this. One, I don't know that how you would be able to secure this technology, so to speak. Like, if people are able to get scammed every day by random texts and messages and things like that, not really sure how secure this is going to be. Plus, I don't know the sort of systems that are going to be put in place. I think that the affirmation would have to do a good job to prove that this would be a secure system. Reason why I say the app has to do that is because I think the neg has a pretty strong side in this, because the neg can go up and say like, this is logistically hard, if not impossible, to do first and foremost. But second, even if it is not logistically hard to do, it is something that is going to be heavily criticized or looked at with a lot of scrutiny by a lot of Americans, by a lot of people, right? We already saw the crazy controversy that came from mail in ballots. Now you go from mail in ballots to phones, and that is like a whole new can of worms. And like, even if it is possible, is there going to be like a lot of doubt, a lot of distrust in the system? And is that going to deter people from voting? Is that going to throw people off and things like that? So, affirmation strength is, or their kind of core idea is accessibility and access. Neg is going to be logistics and or fear slash um, distrust and belief in the system, so to speak. So I'd probably, if I had to go like today, probably like neg sided. Could be wrong. Could, maybe technology could reveal itself, but I feel like that is kind of where this is at right now. This is a bill that I saw before, as I was helping someone prepare for Stanford. A bill to support Venezuelan migrants, 500 million to the Peruvian government to supplement their efforts to support Venezuelan migrants within Peru's borders. Could be balanced. I think probably going to be half-sided. Reason being, looking at the situation right now after the kind of destabilization slash overthrow of Venezuela, even before that happened, there were a lot of migrants leaving Venezuela to find more stable living conditions, whether it be in other Latin American countries or in the United States itself. And a lot of migrants right now are going to Peru. And just causing sort of like a crisis within itself because with so many people going into the country, it's a lot more people to aid. There's going to be have to things like refugee and migrant camps that have to be set up, and a lot of people just seeking asylum and seeking protection. So I don't know how this would go over well in like a congressional debate speech, but if someone were to be like, I mean, like we destabilize the country, bare minimum of what we can do is like aid migrants and things like that. I don't think that would go over too well, but that's kind of like my thought process is like if I was a legislator in this scenario, I'd be like, yeah, like one, it was destabilized and there was no plan to like make sure that there's structure and order. Bare minimum, we should assist sort of like countries when there is overflow, when there are these now issues coming out of this. Other things to talk about of why this is kind of like important for human rights. One, without money, without assistance and things like that to Peru to assist this crisis, like it's not like the migrants are gonna stop if we don't give them money. They'll still be there. It's just the difference is are they gonna be there in better conditions, with proper humanitarian support, with infrastructure, with resettlement programs and things like that. Like bare minimum, give them a better condition slash place to live in because one thing that is very common, and this is across the world, when there are sort of like refugee camps or migrant camps with conditions that are very squalor or that are particularly like disheveled or set up in places that aren't well taken care of, those situations, one, breed a sentiment either against the host nation or even against the United States, saying like this thing happened to us and now they don't care about us, they're not even trying to help. And that's how there's one, anti-American sentiment, and two, you also get these problems within those camps where if the condition remains bad for such a long period of time, you also get things like violence that come out and disease that spread. And it's not just contained to sort of these refugee and migrant populations, but also the population of the host country. And maybe it can, spread and, build out and things like that. And it's also where gangs find the most amount of power because gangs get to take advantage of the weakest people, of the most desperate people. So that's why I think the act can probably be pretty strong just off of face value, off of glance. Um, and I think that's probably what I would go for as like the most solid side to lean on right now. Neg, I don't know. You have these angles of like aid extortion, like maybe it won't work. Probably the best maybe that you can go for is either aid extortion or money is going to be used for for abuse if maybe this national police force isn't trustworthy enough, or like what is this direct payment system, maybe it might not be the most accurate, but I feel like the app has a lot more layers on it that is working for it right now, so I would probably lean app. Okay, let's move into finals, the spiciest of times. A bill to support nuclear investment and the clean energy transition. Appropriate $100 billion over the next 10 fiscal years to the Department of Energy for the expansion of nuclear infrastructure. Oh my goodness. Small modular reactors. Tax at 15% on. Similar analysis to what I gave on the previous legislations. This is going to be a debate of numbers. So, one, we need some good justification why nuclear energy should receive this amount of money. If I'm on the app, I'm giving you specific statistics. I'm like, this is why nuclear is important. It's the most reliable, it's the most widespread form of like energy right now. In terms of the renewable energy we've been using, we've probably been using it for, the longest time, I believe. And I think in Georgia was the state that recently just had a nuclear reactor kind of open and things like that. So it's really a game of numbers improving. This is how Americans directly benefit from increased investment in nuclear energy. This is why Americans need it. And besides that, like when we think of things like wind energy, solar energy, hydroelectric, geothermal, and things like that, nuclear energy has proven the most resilient, the most reliable because it's the one we've been working with for the most amount of time. And if I'm looking at this from a perspective of what can fill in the gaps of like when there's no wind and when there's no sun and things like that, I'm probably going to rely to nuclear because it can run constantly. And if we have some law changes specifically to things like how we recycle nuclear waste and things like that, nuclear waste can still be like recycled and turned into some form of energy. So I think it can be particularly powerful and resilient. And I think there's actually like, just like, a debate brain aside, I think there's like huge potential. But that is also where I'd say, big strength in the negation is going to lie in the numbers that they can find, right? If this bill is going to take effect 1 year after its date of passage, which is literally a year later, and now we have a 15%, tax on extraction and production of oil, I mean, immediately goes to price increases, right? Like how are like you can have a nuclear, power plant, right? But your car isn't going to run on nuclear energy, at least not anytime soon. You're still going to need like natural gas for stoves and things, unless you have an electric stove. And I think there would still be a role that is domestic oil is going to have to play. So cost is going to be a factor somewhere. And are we doing too much in too little of amount of time? And is nuclear even the right way to go? I think there can be significant doubt casted on whether nuclear is good or not. So props to Harvard tab staff on this. I think this is a pretty balanced debate. And last but not least, let's look at a bill to prevent evergreening in the medical industry. Medical industry patents to expand affordable access to life-saving treatments. Patent protections to balance innovation incentives with public access by limiting excessive exclusivity periods and preventing anti-competitive patents practices that raise drug price. That's a good idea. A good idea with not a lot of specifics. The practice of obtaining secondary patents for minor modifications to an existing medical product to extend. Hmm. I wish this was more specific. A public health necessity refers to any device or treatment. Okay. And penalize anti-competitive patent practices that restrict generic or biosimilar. Again, this is super vague. Um, Looking at the chat. Stanford Online about to start the third round. Any tips on POing? POing online? Have you know time cards? Like I have flashcards right here. What was I gonna say? Have like colored flashcards if you don't already have them. One has 2 minutes, one 2:30, 2:55, or actually it should be 2:30, 2:55, and then have another one for cross examination as well, where you have like a 20 seconds and then like a stop or something like that. Other tips for POing is just use it like Google Sheet. It's super helpful. Also, if you go to our YouTube channel and go look at the PO video, there's a ready to go PO sheet right there. So you can use that and just like plug names in and move them over as you go. And specifically for POing online, just keep it moving. Don't make mistakes. Like as long as don't make any mistakes, you should be fine. but just like keep it snappy and to the point. You don't have to have all that other kind of like side chatting and side conversations that you would have in an in-person round. Just keep the round moving. You should be good. But yeah, as it comes to this last piece of legislation, I can tell you what most Americans and most adult thinks. I think most Americans would like a legislation like this, with the exception of the Americans that might be working in the pharmaceutical industry themselves. The reason being is because basically this practice of evergreening, there's a really good, I think it's either last week tonight, like a John Oliver video of this online. You should look it up on YouTube after this. But essentially what happens with medical patents in some cases is that companies don't have to prove that the drug is better. They just have to prove that there was a change or a modification made to it, right? That is what we refer to by evergreening, where that's where they extend their period of exclusivity by saying, oh, we're going to file this patent on our drug. It's still going to remain exclusive. You can't make a generic of it. And it's because the ingredient is different by this much. This is the modification that was made and things like that. What I really don't like about this legislation is how vague the definitions are and how the FTC even decides who to penalize, who like, gets this treatment or not. I can say like off of bias, judges are probably going to think that the AF is better. A judge would probably like the AF to exist in the real world. On the neg though, I think maybe find a way to exploit the vagueness of section 2B and 3B. I don't know how this would be decided by the FTC. If you can prove that the people in charge aren't going to rule well on it or rule accurately, that is something that can happen. Maybe you can even point out there are times where modifications are actually made for good things, and it's important to keep exclusivity, but I doubt it. But it's it's so weird to me because in my mind, it should be balanced because of how vague it is, but I don't know how much evidence you can specifically collect and say, like, because it is this vague, here's the specific, like, net harm that will happen as a result of this. But I think that the AF is probably going to be the stronger side in this. I do know a Kareem, yeah. We debated a couple of times before. I think he might be a year, maybe two below me in terms of grade. So yeah, cool guy. So yeah, this is kind of, my overview with the break uh after this where, we have this breakdown of like Qatar debate. But this is essentially what I would say, right? Haitian Recovery Act, I think that's gonna be neg sided because one, we've tried this before. Two, I think you can rely on the UN taking action thing. And three, there's not a lot of people that would support the involvement of troops going into Haiti. And also, we would never actually, like in real life, we would never actually send troops into Haiti. What more accurately happens and what has actually happened in the past is we go to like a different island in the Caribbean, train the police, and then send them over, which is good for protecting U.S. troops. But in terms of enforcement, it's actually really bad because you get these issues where you train the police, but then there's no like sort of direct leadership when they're actually in these situations, and sometimes there's corruption within the police force. Because you're teaching them essentially like how to use a weapon, not when to use a weapon. And then you get like other problems as well, such as like not like super direct oversight and leadership and things like that. And 1 billion is kind of a lot of money in this situation. So I think if you take action in Haiti, it has to be joint action. We also looked at ban the use of AI in ICE and Border Patrol. I think this is AF-sided based off of the current sentiment surrounding ICE. The neg strength lies in this right here. If I'm on the neg speech, I'd say something along the lines of yes, we should limit ICE's authority, limit ICE's power, but U.S. border and customs, U.S. border and custom protections, that might encompass a lot more than ICE. Like, what are the responsibilities of U.S. border and customs protections? Let's actually look it up right now. Who works for them? Not in this sense, like what is TSA under? I wonder if they're more specifically under border customs and border. I wonder if there's like a triangle chart for it. But yeah, like if I well, let's just find it. U.S. Customs and Border Protection sub agency. border patrol strategy. I guess this is like monitoring strictly like the southern border and things like that. Also, like Montana, northern border, I guess. Um, I don't know. I think one thing that you might be able to argue as part of U.S. Customs and Border Protections is maybe airports count as a port of entry as well. I think one thing that you can say is like, yes, ICE's power should be limited, but U.S. border and customs protection encompasses like more than that, right? It encompasses, you know, preventing human trafficking from happening from either like the southern border or other ports of entries. It also maybe might be technology used in airports. Maybe like airports count as like ports of entry where people are coming in and leaving, and like yeah, maybe ICE shouldn't have access to AI, but US border and customs protection should if they're protecting things like drug smuggling from happening or human smuggling from happening. So I think if I had to go for a neg angle, it would say ban ICE from having this power, but US border and customs protection shouldn't. Like pass a bill that limits ICE's power, but not US border and customs protections. And I would kind of like hinge my negation speech on the importance of this rather than the importance of this. What else did we look at? Aid Egypt looks absided right now. Might need some more research. In terms of what I'm thinking, like just giving aid to the region might be important. Yes, you have those sort of arguments of like, oh, it could be extorted, oh, it can be taken away, but you have like U.S. troops backing it up. I'm like, aid tracking is like getting a lot better. Slash like as long as like you can make the argument on the app that if like a majority, like a significant majority of aid is getting to its destination, it's a good thing. And especially considering this new influx of possible refugees and things that could happen, like aid is probably going to be pretty important. And Egypt's an ally of ours. Halting expansion of United States ICBMs, like I said, probably a bad idea. Like people like to feel protected. I don't think anyone wants to not be protected in this situation and in this scenario. And I think it's just good to update sort of like your arsenal of weapons because it is better to be prepared than underprepared. And especially when you consider the upkeep of old ICBMs, like it's probably more expensive and more dangerous to upkeep the old ones than to refit the arsenal with new ones. Promote AI intelligence education in schools. Again, I think that's pretty app-sided. I can't think of many reasons why people would say no to education, why it's a bad thing. Neg, maybe you can lie and say saying like, oh, maybe the private sector is going to teach bias education, maybe it's going to be bad and things like that. Maybe the resources are going to be biased, or I think I would look to issues in the past where we have said like let's have this curriculum and then the private sector got involved and it was particularly like bad or mismanaged or things like that. But I think that's where I would look towards, but it seems like the app is really good because to any parent's mind, which is your judge, it's like my kid should probably be like well educated on the issues of AI. American Drilling and Reform Act, like I said, relatively balanced, pretty even debate. um, it has to just comes down to numbers. Minimum wage workers for incarcerated individuals. Can't think of too many people that would say like no, like people that work jobs should not be paid the minimum wage. Maybe you get a few people that say that. I can't really see it. And then the last is recognize the Republic of Somaliland. Balance, maybe lean neg. Again, this is all about not just the recognition, but what happens after recognition. The winner of this debate proves to me that after recognition, this is what happens. Therefore, this is good. Therefore, this is bad. If I'm on the app, I prove that after recognition, things get better and things are going to improve because there's a plan. If I'm on the neg, I'm going to prove that like recognition isn't enough because what happens is it just kind of like slips away and things like that. Quarters, app-sided on Qatar. We did the breakdown on that one. Hypersonic missiles, again, app-sided because this is kind of a non-unique situation. Lithium extraction looks a little bit app-sided. Maybe some potential if what exists in Section 3 conflicts with the current policy plans by the current administration, or maybe we should wait for the current administration's policy to take effect first before this gets into effect. But that's probably what I would think of the most. Um, and then off of public option, usually app-sided, the neg should probably use section 3A and 3B to their advantage as it takes away funding from other sources, and that's usually a pretty bad thing that happens if you're just like diverting funds away from an organization. So balanced. Sems, neg sided on voting for the sake of I don't see how this would work, and even if it did, we're very turbulent times in terms of democracy right now. built to support Venezuelan migrants. Pretty app-sided right now. I can't think of too many reasons to say no to it. Finals, balance on the first one when it comes to nuclear energy investment. Again, another numbers debate. Numbers debates are usually pretty balanced because it's just about the cards that you find, and then the side will reveal itself. And then patenting, pretty app-sided. Yeah. We went through a quick breakdown of just like, this was for hypersonic missiles. This is kind of just like, understanding breakdown once you've, done your who, what, when, where, why, how. And this is just kind of a look into research and how kind of like prep itself is done. I think since we ran so long, next time, maybe later this week, maybe like later after Harvard, we'll do a more like in-depth, here's how like what prep looks like what is the status quo, like coming up with rhetoric and things of that nature. But for now, I think this is more than enough to work off of. And just advice to anyone going to Harvard: enjoy it. It's a super fun tournament. I always regarded Harvard as kind of the most fun tournament of the year. I think maybe besides nationals, mainly because like you're in Harvard. It's a very historic campus. It's very fun. I'm from California, so snow is pretty rare. It's usually snowing. There's a great hot chocolate many great hot chocolate places nearby, and just it's probably the closest to nationals in terms of when you're in the final round or in other rounds, just meeting a bunch of people and getting to perform in such a front of a large audience and really share your vision, share your voice, and things like that. So prep really hard. I always say you should, feel insecure enough in the prep process to think that there's someone prepping harder than you. Prep super hard and prepare and work your butt off to make sure that you're the most prepared person going into the tournament. But as soon as you're at the tournament, have fun. Be the person who is having the most fun, who has the most joy, because I think it is the worst thing in the world to stress about prep and then go into a tournament and then stress even more and not have any fun. Bring joy, bring energy, bring enthusiasm, and the results will play out itself. Yeah. I'll be releasing more sort of pointers and advice on our social media throughout the week as it regards to Harvard prep, things that you can do to improve and get better. Yes, I can go ahead and share the document with y'all as well because this live stream will exist on YouTube. I'll just link it in the description. And as always, if you're not already in Ascend Academy, you should join. It's a free resource. Access to coaches like me, Aditya, Adrian, Quest, Emily Donaldson, all these other amazing coaches that are really just going to help you elevate your game, especially if you love this activity. If you love this activity and you want to get better, join Ascend Academy. And I'd also love to see you at camp. Like this is just like a taste of like what coaching mindset is like or what debater mindset is like. But it is my opinion that camp is where the most growth happens for debaters. And then programs like Ascend Academy and Sandell Academy is how you keep that growth sustained throughout the year. But camp is a super fun time. It's at a lovely university, amazing campus at the University of the Pacific. Sun's always out. It's great. And it's always a wonderful, wonderful time. So thank you for watching. I'll put this doc in the description. And I hope to see you at the tournament. If you see me, you have questions about any of these bills at the tournament, say hi. If you're on Ascend Academy, shoot me a message on Slack. And even if you're not, send a DM to our Ascend Instagram page or send any sort of message through any of our various contact means. I'll make sure to reach out to you and yeah, make sure it works. But yeah, thank you for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And